Good morning and welcome to day two of the 48th Annual National Conference. I'm Terry Curry from Michigan State University of the School of Human Resources and Labor Relations. It's my pleasure to be the moderator of this first session of today, in which we're going to focus on shared governance, collective bargaining, and the future of online learning in light of COVID-19. The pandemic obviously continues to have a profound impact on all aspects of higher education in the year and a quarter since it's reached the United States. Some of the changes will no doubt be short-lived, but many of the changes at our institutions are long-term, if not permanent. And most notably, the future of online learning. At the same time, a bedrock component of American higher education has been the shared governance system. And as I reflect back decades ago when it seemed novel in industry to talk about employee involvement, at the same time, again, for decades, that had been the norm, has been the norm in US higher education. And it's a system in which faculty and in many cases other stakeholders play a central role in major aspects of institutional decision-making. Over these last 14 months, the system has been used, it's been ignored, it's been tested, it's been challenged across our institutions. And for those faculty and staff and graduate students who are represented by unions, the collective bargaining process has similarly been tested and challenged and used and on occasion ignored when it shouldn't have been. So in this workshop, we're going to examine the current changes, the challenges that both individuals and institutions are facing, and explore what's to come for shared governance, collective bargaining, and in particular, online learning. What does it mean for all of us? It is my pleasure to lead and to moderate for this outstanding group of panelists. I'll introduce them and then turn it over to our first panelist. We will begin with Anthony Picciano, who's professor in the School of Education, Hunter College, and City University of New York Graduate Center. He'll be followed by Irene Mulvey, a professor in the Department of Mathematics at Fairfield University and president of the American Association of University Professors, and then Joe McConnell of the firm Morgan, Brown, and Joy. So with that, I will turn it over to Tony. Let me just say also, we will have some discussion after the individual presentations, and then we'll have questions and answers. Tony, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Terry, for that introduction. And also thank you to Bill Herbert and his colleagues who set up this panel. I think it was very kind of him. And I think it's very, very important that we're at this point, and hopefully we will get past and transition to a more normal future. But anyhow, thank you to all involved with putting on this conference. And again, thank you, Terry, for the introduction. I'm going to discuss mainly this morning, at least my part of the panel is to give a good overview of online learning, where it was, where it is, and where it's going, particularly in light of COVID-19. And I'll leave to my colleagues who have a lot more expertise than I do, Joe and Irene, in terms of some of the real detailed issues of collective bargaining and shared governance. So, one second. Okay, there we go. Okay, now I'm sorry, I just lost my place for a second. So in talking what will happen in the future, I'd like to say, and I'm not the first one to have said this, but what will happen in the future is easy to predict. But it's when it will happen that is the hard part, particularly when it comes with technology, which can be very dynamic. It can change very quickly at times and then kind of give a lot of false promises of what might come. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to quote Bill Gates. When I put the slide together about a month or so ago, Bill Gates was still associated with Microsoft and not with lots of other legal issues in terms of divorces and what have you. So, but I still think he has a pulse on what happens with technology. But Bill Gates said, we always overestimate the change that will occur in the next 2 years and underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. Into action. I think that's a very important comment regarding technology. There's a lot of individuals with lots of experience who predict a lot of things, some of which come through, some of which don't. And frequently it's a question of when some of these things come through. Before COVID-19, not just higher ed, but our entire society was moving in a direction where technology was shaping what we call man-machine interfacing. And typically, when we talk about this right now, I would bet that just about everyone in our audience has an iPhone, some other type of device in their pockets or in their cases. And we're getting closer and closer to where we are interacting with machines, digital technology, on a regular basis every day of our lives. But if we look down
Tony, you're muted. We lost you for a second and now you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I don't know why. Let me get to, I was on this slide. Is this when I got muted?
You're not sharing right now.
I'm not sharing.
You were, but now you're not.
Okay, let me. Am I sharing now?
Not on my screen. It looks like Irene is saying no also.
Let me try this again. Are we sharing now?
We are sharing again.
Okay, thank you. Okay. I think I was here when I lost my connection, or is that true?
Yes.
Okay. So as I was saying, I'm not sure exactly where we were, but we're moving to a man-machine interfacing. And when we talk about machine, we talk about digital technologies. And the four major thrusts are supercloud computing, artificial intelligence, robotics, and biosensing devices. Biosensing is something that connects us, the person to equipment or to machines. Right now, many of us do not connect directly, but there are incredible developments in the area of medicine that will affect a lot of how we interface with technology in the future. But right now, we're seeing a lot of development in supercloud and in artificial intelligence in higher education, as well as the entire society. All of this is built on nanotechnology and quantum computing, which continues to advance on a regular basis. Right now, there's billions of dollars being spent on developing this technology, and it will dwarf what we do in terms of speed and access to data probably in the next 7, 8, 9 years. Enter COVID-19, and what COVID-19 has done, it has accelerated all the development that had been going on in this area. And so if we look at this acceleration over as we transition to the post-COVID-19 period, we have to keep in mind that big tech was not really adversely affected by COVID-19. If anything, they started to more aggressively invest in developing their hardware and software, and particularly artificial intelligence. In terms of people and businesses and other organizations, including colleges and universities, which will be the focus of our discussion this morning, they all embraced online technology, in most cases because they had to, but in the transition period and beyond, it's my sense that they will continue to embrace online technology, and we will move into a new normal that will be significantly more technology dependent. And about a month ago, I gave a talk and at a online learning conference, and myself and my colleague who were on that, who shared the presentation, we basically talked about the blended university, and that's what we're moving to. And I have every confidence that that's what we will see, not just down the road a piece, but in the transition period and into the next 3, 4, 5 years. In terms of online and blended learning, the reason why I think that we'll see this kind of move to a blended university is that many faculty, particularly those who had not taught in online environments in the past, see it as a convenient alternative to face-to-face learning, especially in community colleges and colleges with large commuter populations. Where I am at the City University of New York, we have 500,000 students, 95% of whom commute to their schools. Students see it as a convenient alternative to face-to-face learning that fits well with their busy lives, work and family responsibilities. And the latest data I saw is that something like 70% of all students who attend college in the present day do some work or have family responsibilities. The role of the student who attends an on-campus school, is a resident, attends full-time, and will complete their degree in 4 years, that is not necessarily the norm anymore. Administrators are coming to see it as a cost-effective alternative to face-to-face instruction, especially for graduate and professional programs. And policymakers see it as a means to expand access to higher education. There was a major initiative in California with their community colleges a few years ago, where they invested something like $25 million into online platforms, all directed to their community college students. And the main purpose was to expand access. In addition, private companies have already invested in, but they are now invested much more significantly in online adaptive courses, most of which are infused with some, I would say, basic artificial intelligence, but in the not too distant future, we would see more sophisticated artificial intelligence develop. I don't want to get off on too far of a tangent here, but there are all kinds of artificial intelligence applications, some of which are very basic, some of which are fairly complex. We are in the early stages of artificial intelligence, but there's some significant development that is evolving. And I would look at companies like Alphabet, which is Google's parent company, and within there, there's an organization called DeepMind, which is a British organization. They are really aiming to develop what we would call general artificial intelligence, which is a very difficult application. But I do think we will see developments in that area in the not too distant future. In terms of higher education's future in general, with COVID-19, I think we have to look at short-term versus long-term and the effects on collective bargaining and shared governance. We all moved into an emergency mode, which forced some of our colleges, if not many of our colleges and universities, to bypass the normal governance processes. Issues of workload, class size, faculty observation, student evaluations, promotion, tenure decisions were compromised, in some cases deferred. There was an acceleration in the expansion of contingent faculty. I think this is an area in particular we should be concerned about. In the last, I would say, national crisis we had in our country in the Great Recession in 2008 and 2009, when we were forced to really, in many of our schools, to look hard at our finances. It is not an accident that if we looked at by 2010 and 2011, was the turning point where the majority of the courses taught in higher education were now being taught by contingent faculty. I would see the same thing happening as we move out of this national crisis and what have you. Tenure and rules for dismissal were suspended. In some cases, tenure was just put on hold, sometimes with the agreement of both the administration as well as the faculty involved. And rules for dismissal were suspended to some degree, as many of our colleges declared fiscal exigency for doing what they had to do. And then there is a concern about closings, mergers, and consolidations. A lot of this began before the pandemic. We had states like Connecticut, Wisconsin, Georgia that started merging and consolidating their institutions. Since the pandemic, we have state systems like Pennsylvania and Alaska that have moved more rigorously and more quickly into suspending or consolidating a number of their schools. Pennsylvania just announced a few weeks ago where 6 of their public colleges will be reduced to 2. If we wanted to see some data on this, this was something that was made available by the Department of Labor just about a week or 2 ago. And it looks at the number of positions that have been lost in higher education going back 50 years. And if you can look at everything on the green above the line is basically some type of growth. There were a couple of blips there. But if we look at the past year, there was almost a 12% drop in the number of individuals employed in higher education. That equates to at least 570,000 workers. Now, my sense is, and my hope is that many of these workers will be reemployed as we transition out of COVID-19, but I don't think they all will be reemployed. And I'm most concerned about full-time faculty, that many of them will be replaced by contingent or adjunct faculty, is my sense. I hope it doesn't happen, but that's how I feel. If we look at the long-term effects, I think that if we look at our 3 of our major activities in colleges and universities, and this is going to move us more into the late 2020s, early 2030s. In teaching, it is possible to consider faculty will assume the roles of aides in AI-infused adaptive software. Contingent faculty will become the norm. If we look at some of the institutions that have committed totally to online development, this is already moved. Some of our colleges have already moved in this direction. We look at the University of Southern New Hampshire. We look at Western Governors University, both of which enroll hundreds of thousands of students. Many of the courses are designed by master teachers who are paid fairly well, but almost all the courses are taught by contingent faculty, which basically they're hired from course to course. I'm concerned about that. That may become more the norm as we move into the late 2020s. Research, it is quite possible that researchers who, for decades, took great pride in their labs and what they did in their labs. I think that we are going to see a move where, I'll say a blended approach, but a lot of researchers will assume the roles of assistants to AI algorithms. And student administrative services will be provided mostly by cloud-based applications. I think we're already seeing a movement in this direction. We see certain applications such as email being moved out of local computer facilities or campus-based computer facilities and moved into cloud-based applications. We're also beginning to see what we call mission-critical applications, such as our learning management system or course management systems. They are also moving to a cloud-based application that is out of our universities and out of our college campuses. I think we will see most of our student administrative services platform not at the local colleges, but on a cloud application. This would also have some really important issues regarding standardization of what we teach and how we advise. So some critical questions. I think we have to ask, will we have a better higher education system? Are faculty, researchers, administrators, and student support staff ready and able to work with new technologies? And are they willing to yield control of their prerogatives to these technologies? Does digital learning of the future offer the possibility of alleviating educational economic inequality or worsening it? And here are two views. Joseph Ahn, who's the president of Northeastern University and author of Robot Proof, Higher Education in the Age of Artificial Intelligence on the Future of Higher Education. He acknowledges that American colleges and universities are among the fullest expressions of human culture ever evolved, and perhaps the most effective institutions for intellectual advancement ever developed. However, he went on to caution that if they fail to respond creatively and deliberately to the technological advances that they face, they will wither into irrelevance. A slightly different view, Drew Faust, who is the former president of Harvard Education, in an address to the World Economic Forum, addressed three major forces that will shape the future of higher education: the influence of technology, the changing shape of knowledge, and the attempt to define the value of education. And her, to quote her comment, her closing comment, so much of what humanity has achieved has been sparked and sustained by the research and teaching that takes place every day at colleges and universities. Sites of curiosity and creativity that nurture some of the finest aspirations of individuals and in turn improve their lives and their livelihoods. As the landscape continues to change, we must be careful to protect the ideals at the heart of higher education, ideals that have served us well as we work together to improve the world. My sense is we're going to see somewhere between those two views. I think both presidents are committed to what they believe, to their beliefs, but they're very different futures in what they're seeing. If you're interested in anything I've said, there's an article that was published, the title of which was Artificial Intelligence and the Academy's Loss of Purpose. It is available on a free download on the Online Learning Journal. Here's the website. And also I have an article coming out shortly in the Journal of Collective Bargaining in the Academy, Online Learning, COVID-19 and the Future of the Academy, Implications for Faculty Governance and Collective Bargaining. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony.
Thanks, Terry. Are you all seeing my screen?
We're seeing your desktop though, not the
Oh,
PowerPoint.
okay. Sorry. It's like, okay. Thanks. It's like looking in seeing in my closet. Good now. I would like to thank the Center for Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the professions, and in particular, the Executive Director, Bill Herbert, for inviting me to participate in this year's 48th annual conference. I'm really happy to participate in today's panel on shared governance, collective bargaining, and the future of online learning in light of COVID-19. I really wish we could be presenting this panel in person, but that is, like many things, not in the cards this year. It's fortunate and remarkable that it's relatively easy to have the conference virtually. And as we all know, there are pros and cons in having the center's conference online, but I certainly would prefer to be in person. So we have a very timely topic. And as you know, distance education and online learning have been with us for some time. But obviously the pandemic ushered in unexpected changes. The pandemic sped up and possibly changed the trajectory of online learning in the academy. So let's talk about the impact that may have on collective bargaining in higher education and on shared governance. And let's talk about some of the challenges that have risen as a result of so much of our teaching going online as a result of the pandemic. As Professor Curry said, I am president of the American Association of University Professors. If you aren't immediately familiar with the AAUP, on this slide, you can read our mission. For 106 years, the AAUP has been developing the standards and procedures that maintain quality in education and academic freedom in this country's colleges and universities. We promote higher education as a common good and as absolutely essential for a democracy. So that's the perspective I speak from today. So let's remember back to January, February, and March 2020, as we were watching helplessly as a deadly and highly infectious virus took over the globe. Every aspect of daily life was affected. There was widespread worry, anxiety, and fear, and with good reason. So many lives were lost. So many people died, difficult and lonely deaths, and so many people lost loved ones. I appreciate Bill Herbert's, if you saw the opening remarks yesterday, Bill Herbert had some moving comments about this. And then there was additional stress and added anxiety for faculty, administrators, for students, for everyone, around childcare, elder care, family members, relationships, and everything. And higher education was no exception. I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the excellent panel yesterday evening on the devastating effects of the pandemic on academic women. I'm not emphasizing that discrepancy in today's panel, but it is important that we acknowledge and keep in mind how the effects of the pandemic were disproportionately felt across the academy, and how hard marginalized groups already in precarious positions in higher ed were hit by COVID. So, and there'll be another panel on COVID and racial inequity tomorrow, Wednesday, that I'm not emphasizing that disproportionate effect either. But we must acknowledge it and keep that in mind as the context for everything we discuss. So back to higher ed, there's a lot to talk about here. How were decisions made? By whom were decisions made with regard to shared governance and collective bargaining? What were the guiding principles and priorities behind the decisions? And at the AAUP, we were very quick to post a resource site on our webpage with resources and guidance for faculty members on any number of issues, way beyond the scope of this panel, that arose as a result of the pandemic. And we've been updating this page regularly with additional resources to help our AAUP chapters. So the link is on this slide, and I would drop it into the chat, but I'm afraid I'll lose my screen sharing. But the link is here on this slide, and many of these resources are still very, very relevant. There's a lot of information up there, very cleanly organized for whatever you might need. Because our policies, AAUP policies and statements, are based on fundamental principles of academic freedom and shared governance with primary responsibility for decision-making based on area of expertise, the bottom line is that our longstanding policies and derivative statements continue to apply. They are broad enough and flexible enough and should be upheld even in a crisis, especially in a crisis, because they're based on rock solid fundamental principles. Many of the important issues that need to be addressed as a result of the changes caused by the pandemic are being discussed at other sessions in the center's conference. But here in this panel, we're just focused on online learning, which the pandemic changed abruptly and profoundly. And we're going to discuss the challenges and opportunities that were discovered and the resulting impacts on shared governance and collective bargaining. So the pandemic forced instruction online. In most cases, minimal preparation. Now, at many schools, staff in our centers for teaching and learning really stepped up with training. You know, through February, they were having training sessions every day to help you figure out how to move a class that you had prepared to be in person for the whole semester, and now you had to move it online on a dime. And so I really want to give a shout out to the staff at those centers for teaching and learning who really stepped up with, you know, helping everyone as we scrambled. But still, you know, having to completely change from in-person teaching to online teaching was a huge lift for faculty. And the fact that the difficulties continued through another full academic year has left faculty, certainly everyone I talked to, completely burnt out and exhausted. It has been a really difficult 15 months for faculty, for students, for everyone. The work was much more difficult and involved. It was really difficult to stay connected with our students, some who just disappeared, you know, especially students without a dedicated place for study or without high-speed internet, Wi-Fi. And then all sorts of faculty were all of a sudden faced with addressing mental health issues for students who are struggling. And many institutions negotiated, you know, give backs or in either in CB settings or non-CB settings, or reductions in benefits were, you know, so people, some faculty, some institutions negotiated give backs in order to save jobs. Other schools had reductions in benefits negotiated or imposed. So faculty were doing a lot. So everyone was doing a lot more, and sometimes for less. Now, if you want to look for a silver lining, you can see the bottom bullet here. There was an opportunity. Faculty were forced to see how online teaching might work for their subject. So that was something that, you know, many of us have been thinking we'll get to when we have time, and now we were forced to do it. But online teaching is simply one modality. And it's just, teaching online is just one way to teach. And under AAUP policy, faculty have primary responsibility for decision-making on all academic matters, including curriculum, subject matter, method of instructions, that emphasis is mine, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life which relate to the educational process. And so, you know, my point is that decisions on modality belong to the faculty and should be based on pedagogy. How a subject is taught must be determined by the instructor. During the pandemic, you know, courses had to be all online in an emergency basis because of the highly infectious and deadly virus. At other, you know, when we started to come back on campus, some institutions mandated that every course needed to have some kind of an in-person component. And they were suggesting you could have graduate students or teaching assistants meet your students in a classroom once a week to check off the in-person component requirement, but the difficulties with this, where the full-time faculty are getting to stay home and stay safe, while the contingent faculty, the teaching assistants, the graduate students are being forced to go in and meet the students in person during the most infectious part of the pandemic, seems to me, quite frankly, unconscionable. And, so in the heat of the pandemic, with room and board revenue on the line, were we making decisions based on methods of instruction and how the instructors wanted to teach, or were we making decisions because we needed a reason to have the students living on campus and paying room and board revenue? But with regard to online teaching, my main point is that it's simply one modality, and it may work in some instances, and it may be completely the wrong approach for some other subject, and that is really up to the instructor to decide. So what will instruction look like post-pandemic? I think my point again is that with or without a pandemic, the decisions on how best to teach should be made by the instructor, depending on the field. And any changes that come, we had emergency changes, of course, as a result of the pandemic. We were forced to do what we had to do, but long-term changes really must come about through a deliberative process. And by that, I mean bona fide shared governance and/or a faculty union that preserves the faculty's decision-making authority in areas over which they have primary responsibility. I mean, when we think about the role of a faculty member in teaching, there are so many aspects to that role, oftentimes, very dependent on the field. I mean, I love teaching, and at its best, there's a real connection between an instructor and a student. When I'm sure we've all experienced that real connection when a genuine breakthrough in learning occurs and when a new level is reached. And that can be through any modality, but it's not about the modality, it's about the genuine breakthrough when learning occurs or a new level is reached. So, like before the pandemic, decisions on how best to teach should be made by faculty. There needs to be a deliberative process. And if we're going to move into online teaching, which is very possible, the opportunities are there for some courses, some, mainly perhaps graduate courses, or courses where it's more convenient, or you can expand access to more people, more students when you have it online. So it's possible that there'll be more online teaching after the pandemic, since we've seen where it works well and we've seen where it doesn't work well, but we need to have training in online teaching, and that has to be provided. And there needs to be an acknowledgement of the extra burden to teach using new methods. I'm aware of, anecdotally, some institutions giving full-time faculty a course release to be used over the next 3 years, in acknowledgement of how difficult things were over the last 15 months. But so that's one thing. But if we're training in online teaching has to be provided, faculty need to be trained in this. But really, it is a faculty prerogative. Their faculty found online elements that may have worked well. They'll surely incorporate these practices into their classes. I got a couple more issues. We could spend a lot more time on this, but oh, I'm sorry, one more slide. Again, with or without a pandemic, the fundamental process of teaching, where a student gains knowledge or expertise and develops a deeper understanding of some aspect of the rule, is a privilege and honor entrusted to the teaching faculty of an institution. And I think that to me is a bedrock principle that we stand on when we decide whether we're going to do online teaching or incorporate elements of online teaching into our classes, or because I'm maybe teaching a seminar on very sensitive issues, I'm going to insist it be in person and where the discussion can be guided by an expert. I've got a couple more issues here. Sure, you know, as we move forward into further online teaching, there are the academic freedom issues. I mean, how is academic freedom protected and guaranteed when content is delivered through a private for-profit platform? If you weren't familiar with Zoom before the pandemic, you are now, because it's used for everything. But, you know, without hashing through all the details, many of today's participants may recall that Zoom bowed to pressure from third parties and banned an event at San Francisco State University for violating its terms of service. That university-sponsored event, banned by Zoom, was moved to YouTube, and then YouTube pulled the plug on it after about 20 minutes. So when online learning is under the control of a for-profit private corporation, this is much too precarious a situation and a real threat to academic freedom. Now, ultimately, at least for now, we ended up in a pretty good position because Zoom issued a statement on academic freedom for our higher education users on April 13th, in which they, quote, take special guidance from the AAUP's 1940 Statement of Principles on Academic Freedom and Tenure, end quote. And their decision is they aren't going to make a decision to send, their statement says they aren't going to make a decision to censor any content when it is related, quote, related to the institution's academics or operations, end quote. I mean, they may censor things under some carefully defined list, but I'm still worried, and I wonder that if institutions need to negotiate protections for academic freedom per the AAP's 1940 statement into their usage agreements with Zoom. I mean, this whole story is in an excellent blog post with lots of links written by Committee A Chair Hank Reichman the day after the Zoom issued the statement. It's on the Academe blog on April 14th. I meant to have the link here, but I forgot. But anyways, you know, we're in a good position here now. Oops, we're in a good position here now, but it was really precarious for a while there and extremely concerning. Another issue is copyright issues, intellectual property issues. Now, I am not an expert on US copyright law, but we certainly have experts, and it is my understanding that under US copyright law, faculty retain ownership of their course materials unless they affirmatively make a work for hire arrangement. And so going forward, and with this may be a bigger issue now that we're putting all of our stuff up on learning management systems, and you know, institutions may try to make, you know, claim that ownership of faculty's work, and these are really important issues that collective bargaining chapters, collective bargaining faculty, and all faculty should be very careful and deliberate going forward on these issues, because I think these are much more important to sort out with the increase in online learning. With regard to, you know, as the title of the panel is on shared governance and collective bargaining, I mean, as I said a minute ago, you know, faculty know, and administrations need to acknowledge how much harder it was over the last year and a half. And other panels are discussing, you know, what happened to the contingent faculty, to non-tenure track faculty, what happened to shared governance, what happened to appropriate decision-making. It's it's time to get get all of these things back on track. And so all of these matters that have been brought to light as a result of the pandemic have to be decided through a deliberative process. Bona fide shared governance, which in my view meshes with collective bargaining. And this this first bullet is a statement, as a quote from the AAP statement on collective bargaining, that collective bargaining can be used to increase the effectiveness of those institutions of shared governance by extending their areas of competence, defining their authority, and strengthening their voices in areas of shared governance and shared authority and responsibility. So I think we've seen the opportunities, we've seen the challenges, but in my view, the bottom line is that everything should be viewed through a shared governance lens where we protect the profession, protect the core academic mission of our institutions, and protect the profession and keep it a profession that up and coming graduate students will want to join. So I thank you very much, and I will look forward to our next panelist.
Thank you, Irene. Joe.
I assume you all are seeing my screen and can hear me, and one of my panelist friends will certainly tell me if I'm deficient in my technology. Good morning. My name is Joe McConnell. I'm a partner at Morgan, Brown & Joy, and I and my firm do a fair amount of work in higher education, and in particular collective bargaining of all sorts, and in particular within that group, faculty groups. So I have done collective bargaining with full-time tenure track faculty, with full-time non-tenure track faculty or contract faculty or lecturers. I've collectively bargained for faculty that is primarily a distance learning faculty, where the main paradigm in that contract is considered a 50% faculty, as well as contingent faculty. I also bargain for adjunct or contingent faculty contracts. And then finally, I also bargain in graduate student contracts. So not saying this to brag or to show off, but just to say the scope of issues that arise in collective bargaining in faculty, and the issue of how COVID interacted with it, as well as the issues of shared governance, touches on each of those different faculty type groups that I think that Irene was talking about too, that the AUP supports as well. And there are myriad issues that arise in all of those different areas, and myriad lessons that were learned because of the time that we had with COVID. So the hardest thing to bargain in any faculty contract, whether it's full-time, part-time, tenure track, adjunct, graduate student, is workload. And the workload provision of any collective bargaining agreement is absolutely the most difficult and often contentious provision of any agreement. And workload issues were central to the changes that COVID brought about, and then the lessons that we're learning from COVID for the future that Tony was discussing, as well as Irene. So to start, sort of what is workload, right? So you have an article in the contract that's called workload, and it's an attempt to describe what the work expectations are for the faculty or graduate students who are covered by that contract. And I'd like to start sort of with the big picture, which is what is workload supposed to do? So the first thing is it reflects values of the institution and values of the academy, as Irene was describing, right? Those traditional values that the AUP has and all colleges and universities have stood for. And so in general, I think these are the values that go into workload. First and foremost is always service to students, right? So while workload describes the work expectations for individuals performing a job, the bedrock on any of that is always, how does it best serve students, right? How does it best serve the product that's being presented, i.e. service to students in an educational setting? The next biggest issue or bedrock issue in workload is, what is the reasonable expectation for full-time professional efforts? And for full-time faculty, in some ways, I always fall back on, well, it's a full-time exempt job. So that doesn't mean every week is 40 or 45 hours. Some weeks might be less, some weeks might be much more, right? But the idea for full-timers is you are expected to provide your full-time professional services to the institution in exchange for a salary. When you get into part-time, or I've got the horrible situation of a contract that's got a 50% faculty, a 40% faculty, and even a 90% faculty, which, if I can give any advice to the group, never bargain a 90% faculty, because you cannot tell me what that means, that someone gives 90% of their professional efforts to the institution. But in any event, there are all sorts of models. But what can you reasonably expect as, and you know, I just represent the administration, right? The colleges or universities. What can they as employers reasonably expect of someone when they're hiring either a full-time, a half-time, or a part-time? So the big picture is, as most folks on this both on our panel, but probably listening know, it is that balance of teaching, service, and scholarship. Now, some institutions that are non-research institutions, scholarship might be a diminished or a lesser issue. But for full-timers, there's always a balance of teaching and other obligations, whether they're administrative or considered service. The next issue that's always a headbanger is equity among faculty, right? So if you're going to treat faculty similarly and pay them salaries that are similar to each other in the full-time context, how is it fair that one faculty member might do a lot more work and the other faculty member might do less work, right? And I have these discussions at the bargaining table with different faculty teams all the time, that everyone recognizes there are those faculty members, and usually they're the people who are on collective bargaining teams, that do get called on to do more service than others because they're willing to, they do it willingly, they do it passionately. There are other faculty, and probably no one that anyone listening or on our panel knows, but that do less of that and try to avoid obligations that are other than their specific classroom obligations. But if they're a full-time faculty member, they do have service obligations, not just serving on a committee, but doing myriad other things, right, to serve the institution. So that's a big issue in workload descriptions and collective bargaining. And then finally, one of the major issues of collective bargaining, fair compensation for full-time work and bargaining towards that. And then when do you click over to extra pay for extraordinary work? So for a full-timer, whether that's an overload concept or a release concept, that can be relatively standardized. When you get into like my world of 50 and 40% faculty or just contingent faculty, is the teaching in the classroom the main workload paradigm, or is it something more than that? And getting to that and determining when extra pays are decided and when workload is expanded beyond what the agreement allows for can be contentious. So those are the sort of the values of workload, the baseline of what we deal with at the bargaining table, moving into these issues of what happened with COVID and then what are the lessons coming out of COVID. Finally, collective bargaining agreements are like Tolstoy's Unhappy Families. They're all a little bit different in their own way. And how workload is measured is different in every collective bargaining agreement. I've got collective bargaining agreements where workload is described in a single paragraph. I've got collective bargaining agreements where workload is described over 15 pages or more. And I've come to the conclusion, just as a professional who deals with a bunch of different contracts, is you can't force it to be thought of one way or another, and each institution has particular ways of thinking about it, and the faculty themselves have particular ways of thinking about it. But what are the standards? So first is credits, right? So the idea that you're teaching a 3-credit course or a 4-credit course, that's the equivalent of normally that many hours in the classroom. It gets complicated when you get into labs or you get into things like, in the arts and where you have a broader, the credits are 4, but the contact hours are 12, right? And so then some contracts do that contact hours. So how many hours in front of students, and that's the measure by which you determine a full-time faculty's load. Some contracts have limits on the number of students served. Either there's a course cap limit, there's a course minimum limit for the number of students. There are contracts that I have where there's extra pay if the number of students go above a certain number. Other contracts don't have extra pay, but they do have an acknowledgement of that in balancing a faculty member's workload, or they have things like TAs, right? So if the course number goes above 30 or 35, there will be a TA assigned to assist the faculty member in that course. Other contracts have limitations on what's called preparations, right? So that's how many unique courses is someone teaching. So you can have no more than 3 preps. So if you're teaching 5 courses, 4 courses, you can't have more than 2 or 3 preps, which means teaching the same course twice, where you have to prepare for different courses. And then finally, there's releases and trade-offs, right? So, Irene talked about the benefit of getting an additional release, potentially for the hard work that folks did during COVID. But most collective bargaining agreements are full of the concept of releases, what gets released for what. The most common is for things like department chairs or program chairs. They will get a defined number of releases in order to define their workload. But those issues are all in play when this big issue of workload, which is the biggest issue that you talk about at the bargaining table. And then we've got my friend here who obviously has been working during COVID and is very tired of staring at a computer screen. So thank you for open source clip art. So next, lessons of workload that arose during the COVID-19 semesters. The one thing that every labor lawyer knew immediately, and anyone who deals with faculty assignments knew immediately, for both full-time and part-time faculty, the workload issue and the changes were fundamental changes to the terms and conditions of their employment. So that's labor law 101, which is you have to bargain with the exclusive bargaining agent over the terms and conditions of employment. No one can argue that those changes that occurred because of COVID weren't appropriate to the collective bargaining discussion. Now, as Irene mentioned, a lot of it was happening in an emergency time as well, right? So, whether it was March 1st or March 15th or March 7th or March 20th or February 20th, that your institution made that big switch, it all happened very quickly. And it happened to our personal lives, it happened everywhere. But vis-a-vis teaching, again, most folks probably understand that those changes happen fast, but every institution that I worked with partnered with the faculty unions that were there. And I've got to say, you can become cynical when you just talk to administrators all day and you're just dealing with collective bargaining, and you can be cynical about, oh, the union's motives or whatever. I've got to say, during COVID, there was not one faculty union that did not immediately recognize the massive nature of what was being presented, and that didn't go the extra mile to try to serve their institutions. I didn't hear of a faculty member, even within those unions, that didn't also do the same. So if there is a silver lining to point out another one, just from collective bargaining world that happened during COVID, it was every single union what I would say stepped up to the plate. And hopefully the unions perceived that the administrators similarly, with good faith, came to them and tried to partner to deal with these issues. So let's give ourselves a little bit of pat on the back for that, because I think it's true. Next is time on task, right? So did that change fundamentally? Like, what are you putting in more hours, at its most basic? And it's true for contingent faculty, even more than full-time faculty, but every faculty member ended up working more hours in that COVID transition. And to the extent that some of the distance learning and online learning is going to continue into the future, collective bargaining needs to take that into account moving forward. what is a reasonable expectation of hours? Now, again, I talk about bargaining workload with faculty, and I'm always one, I sit there and I say, don't mess up a good thing, please. I'm a big believer in to over prescribe, like, this takes 45 minutes normally, this takes an hour and a half. You are going to go down a rabbit hole that has too many twists and turns, because faculty are very different from one another. Some faculty, in my experience, look at the job and do a great job, but they look at it as a 9-to-5 job. They get in, and a lot of times this is maybe more in the community colleges that I represent than the sort of larger research institutions, but they think of it as a 9-to-5 job. They come, they do their work, they do their interaction with students, they do their preparations, and then at 5, they tend not to do anything on the weekends or in the evenings. Other faculty, they're on 24/7, 365, and they are answering. Terry was kidding before about answering a 3 a.m. email from a student. There are faculty that are like that. You email your faculty member at 3 a.m., they're going to respond at 3:20. How collective bargaining deals with that, I think, is difficult. And like I said, my main goal at the bargaining table is not to mess things up. So I try to end up on workload that's got that flexibility. And again, COVID really showed us a lot about this. The other is about money, right? People deserve money for working more. That's fundamental. That's, again, labor law 101 across any industry. And so should faculty get paid more time, get paid more, or get more time off because of converting to distance learning, or learning their learning management system for the first time and how that helps with instruction? Should they get paid more or get other considerations for their efforts? And I think the answer to that almost always is yes, in some way. With part-time faculty in particular, and conversion to online teaching and conversion to having to embrace the learning management system if they hadn't done it previously, I think that was a huge deal. They put a lot more effort and a lot more time in vis-a-vis their course than they would normally be expected to go and give a lecture for 3 hours a week at prescribed times. And so again, collective bargaining answer to that is, yeah, they deserve more money for doing those extra efforts in particular. So campus presence. I've had administrators that have asked me for full-time, either tenure track or full-time faculty contracts, to bargain into their contracts a statement, this is before COVID, that says that faculty are generally to be available during the work week and available to administrators. I have been unsuccessful in getting that sentence put into a collective bargaining agreement the 2 or 3 times I've tried to do it over the last 3 years. It's an interesting discussion, though. I just talked about sort of when do faculty do their work and when do they do their jobs. I'll tell you from the administrative perspective, more and more I hear frustration that faculty are resistant to like having a meeting at a certain time. They've got other obligations, they're doing other preparation, whatever. And an administrator, it takes 4 weeks to be able to schedule a meeting where they can have a discussion, let alone a group meeting where you need 5, 6, 10, 12 people together. And so part of the issue is, when are you on campus, right? And so more and more, so let's go to fundamentals though. Treat faculty as self-directed professionals. They're professional people who are largely self-directed. If they have full-time obligations, that they understand that, but you are not in a contract going to micromanage the minutes and hours of most faculty, almost any faculty. My preference here is, don't let the outliers ruin or change the professional relationship with the faculty unit. Oftentimes administrators want something in collective bargaining because of 1 or 2 people who are frustrating. What I tell them is, normally those 1 or 2 people are frustrating to their colleagues as much, if not more, as they are to the administrators. So let's deal with that. Let's deal with, how do you address faculty who are not fulfilling their obligations, not try to create a collective bargaining workload paradigm that tells faculty members that they need to be available between 9 and 5 Monday through Friday, because I think that's probably an unrealistic expectation with most faculty bargaining units. Did that change with remote learning environment? So if you went to synchronous remote learning, or asynchronous even in some aspects, how did that change the idea of when faculty are going to be available, right? So the faculty's efforts may be skewed if you're just looking at hours in a week, towards certain weeks of the semester, certain in other times. And does remote learning have a different idea about when you can expect interaction with faculty? Office hours and expectations of communications with students. I mentioned this a second ago, and Terry was talking about it before we came on. For online faculty, I have found that, before there are any unions, most online contracts for individual online faculty have a statement in it or some handbook that says you will get back to any student that emails you within 48 hours. And those faculty who don't have unions sometimes live with that expectation. When I mentioned that at the bargaining table as part of sort of what do you do to communicate back, I've had faculty tell me that, of course I can get back within 48 hours. I've had other faculty say, what are you, crazy? I'm not like a puppet that's just going to answer any student email at any time. So some of it's just expectations, but can administrators put that in? And then how does that change with COVID? I think COVID made everything weird, right? And is some of that weirdness going to go forward, including the expectations of the students? Are there different workload descriptions and expectations for fully remote faculty? So if someone's teaching exclusively online or largely online, my experience tells me that those faculty actually do, if it's asynchronous in particular, they tend to do a lot more work early in the semester or even before the semester, getting things loaded, designing certain aspects of the course and thinking about the interaction. But those same faculty might have less time on task once the course is up and going, the asynchronous course. Now for synchronous, it's a little more difficult, and then hybrid courses also a little more difficult to describe that, but those are the issues that we're dealing with at the bargaining table. And then my final slide is, can fully remote faculty be in the same bargaining unit as campus-based faculty? And the question there, like in all labor law, is there sufficient community of interest among those groups that they should be in the same collective bargaining unit for bargaining purposes? I had a case that with one of my clients in Vermont, the Vermont State Colleges, that went to their Supreme Court, where the colleges, they had 100% remote teaching faculty that were part-time, or contingent, and then they had an on-campus part-time adjunct contingent faculty unit. The union wanted to put the remote learning, which had traditionally not been part of the unit, into the main bargaining unit. The colleges wanted to keep it out because they said the terms and conditions of employment for 100% contingent faculty, or 100% remote faculty rather, are so different. They get appointed differently. The nature of their coursework is different. They don't see each other. They don't talk to each other in the, in the halls of academia and the like. And ultimately the Vermont Supreme Court, and you can look this up, agreed with the Vermont Labor Relations Board, which agreed essentially with the position that the college took, which is that they should be in separate bargaining units. So people that do 100% remote learning should be in a separate bargaining unit from other contingent faculty who are on campus or do hybrid learning. So post-COVID, are all these distinctions still meaningful for purposes of collective bargaining? Maybe not, but maybe they are. We're going to find out as we move ahead. But I thank you for your attention to these issues. I covered a lot of ground, but I appreciate being able to share the panel with the panelists, and I'll turn it back over to Terry to guide us through the remaining time we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Tony. Man, lot to chew on in all of that. And where do we start? Let me start with maybe a big picture issue, and it relates to things that all of you talked about. But maybe I'll start with Irene with the question: looking across institutions as president of the AAUP, how did shared governance hold up during the pandemic?
What a great question, and what an important question. It depends on the institution in many cases, but I would say that shared governance was trampled on and ignored at a lot of institutions as a result of the pandemic. We have the AAUP is undertaking an investigation into a number of institutions where governance documents were ignored because of the emergency and the financial pressure, which may or may not have been as severe as the institutions predicted. And, so many places, tenured faculty were let go, and which is a complete violation of shared governance. At other places, shared governance fared well. I know there are institutions where they actually came together and negotiated give-backs and cutbacks that would save jobs. And so, it's hard to say. It really does depend on the institution, but I feel like it certainly made clear to me that what we need to do now is to just demand that shared governance be put back into place and respected the way it should be. That's what I have. It was a bad year for shared governance for the most part, but there were some successes.
Joe, Tony, anything to add on that? And maybe the follow-up question for both of you, or actually really for all three of you, what about collective bargaining and how did it fare? And how did it fare relative to Irene's commentary about how shared governance fared?
Well, I would agree with Irene that I think shared governance, she used the term trampled. I used the term in my presentation, compromised. I think Irene's word is more descriptive. And a lot of the colleges did that under the prerogative of fiscal exigency, that they had to do it. And a lot of the, at least I'm not as familiar as Irene and Joe with the plethora of contracts and shared governance documents, but the ones I am familiar with, that was an out that administration frequently had to do almost anything they wanted. And it was my experience that I think that particularly shared governance, which are issues in many schools regarding curriculum, pedagogy, et cetera, were trampled. And I think on collective bargaining, and many of the organizations I've been familiar with, the issue of workload and separation of some sort, that was more on the collective bargaining end. But I think there too, that a lot of the unions basically bowed to the issue of the fiscal situation that they found themselves in a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I think that I think in collective bargaining, I said it during my presentation, I was impressed almost across the board with the common purpose that administrators and the unions had to make the transitions that were necessary to serve the students, right? And so that impressed me a lot. I think on the governance side, I have a rule. I try to keep all talks of governance away from the collective bargaining table, because I see collective bargaining and governance as two different things. And I try to keep it separate. That being said, from anecdote and discussing things with administrators, it was very hard to maintain the pay. Governance, it can be glacial, right? And the problem is that administrators shared with me was, we can't put it through the governance process because we can't get the decision done quickly enough to take the action in the emergency. Now, that could have been sincere or insincere possibly on their parts and what they were sharing with me. But I think that was part of the difference. But collective bargaining, I'll give a passing grade to keep the metaphor going. I'll give a passing grade to collective bargaining during the COVID period.
I would, if I can just add a little bit more to that, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. I'm glad to see collective bargaining is getting a passing grade. I'm glad we're letting a lot of people go pass fail these days. So I'm glad collective bargaining is getting a passing grade, and I appreciate that. And I think it speaks for collective bargaining and the power of collective bargaining. But I want to just go back to the financial exigency issue. I think institutions were under financial pressure. There's no doubt about that, or they were predicting dire financial issues. But in terms of financial exigency, I'm not sure, as the AAUP policy would be that to take drastic measures in order to take drastic measures because of financial exigency, the institution has to declare financial exigency, and not many institutions did that. They were bowing to financial pressure without declaring financial exigency, which the AAUP defines as a bona fide a severe financial crisis that fundamentally compromises the academic integrity of the institution as a whole, and that cannot be alleviated by less drastic measures. And even in that case, the faculty are supposed to have a role in determining whether or not the financial situation is as presented. And once the faculty agree to that, the faculty have a very important role in identifying, individuals whose appointments be terminated and so forth. I mean, this is probably a lot in collective bargaining arguments, but I think just because institutions felt financial pressure, we're not denying that, but the drastic steps they took were really not justified unless the institutions declared financial exigency, which was not done as far as I know.
Well, thank you, Irene. Excellent point. And let me build on something you said in your talk, Irene. You talked about the faculty prerogative with regards to teaching modality as well as content. So as we think about the long-term impact of COVID and the changes that have occurred in online learning, I guess I'm struggling with the cat's out of the bag here now. Getting central administration to relinquish the ability to say, we need to teach a certain percentage of our courses in an online fashion this year for whatever reasons. It's easy with COVID. Next time it might have to do with facilities. It may have to do with something else. What's your sense of the ability for faculty really to regain this ability or to reassert their rights with regards to control of modality as well as content?
Another excellent question, another very important question. I think, with regard to an institute, maybe I wasn't clear on what I was trying to say, but with regard to, the institution saying, we want to teach a certain percentage of courses online, I think that, that's up for negotiation. That should be discussed and within a shared governance setting, within a collective bargaining setting, and the underlying questions are, what kind of an institution are we? Are we a residential living community, or are we, Tony talked about his school, with the community students. So I think in a certain sense, what percentage of courses are taught online is something to be discussed in a shared governance setting, and not certainly the primary responsibility of faculty, but should be discussed collaboratively, and would depend on what kind of an institution we are, what kind of an institution we want to be. My concern was for the institution to impose on an individual, this course must be online. I mean, that's where I feel very concerned. A faculty member might say, I'm teaching a seminar on very sensitive issues of And, you know, I want to have the students in a room where we can look at each other and talk, and the conversation's guided by me so that, you know, things stay safe. So I think I would be concerned with the administration saying, imposing, you know, these courses have to be online when the instructor says, and online is just not appropriate for this course. But in terms of, you know, teaching more courses online, you know, that, like you say, the cat's out of the bag, that's going to happen, but I would like to see it discussed within a shared governance or a collective bargaining setting in ways where the faculty have, the faculty expertise in teaching is what fundamentally helps make the decision happen. I know the others may have better things to say.
Well, I would agree fully with Irene saying, I've been teaching online or blended environments since 1996. I also teach face-to-face, and I pick and choose what I want to teach online, what I want to teach blended, what I want to teach face-to-face, and those are my choices. And my institution allows me to have those choices. I'm totally against what I'm hearing recently in terms of some percentage of courses have to be taught online or some percentage of courses have to be taught face-to-face. My sense is that the faculty should decide that. I think Irene said earlier on, it's the pedagogy that should drive the modality. And I've always preached that in any forum that I've been in. So I tend to agree with Irene that this should stay within the prerogatives of faculty governance. I am concerned, though, that as we move forward, my sense is that whether we have another fiscal issue or fiscal crisis down the road, I think a lot of governing bodies, university college governing bodies, as well as administrations, will be moving faculty to teach online or in blended environments. We had just, and I'll just make one more comment, prior to COVID, there were approximately a third of college students who were taking some type of fully online course. And that number really had kind of plateaued. It was around 6 million students. And that number had plateaued around 2016, 2017. It was not increasing significantly. The percentage of students who were in blended courses, no one really knows because there's never been a good definition of what blended is. And what blended is in Michigan, in University of Michigan or Michigan State, and City University or University of Massachusetts, it's different, not only in the institution, it's different from department to department. So we don't have good data on that. But my sense is that a lot of faculty, particularly those who felt they had a good experience, they will lean towards a blended modality more so than ever because of their experiences during the pandemic.
Can I ask my colleagues a question that's related to that, which has always confused me? With the greater use of course designers in online teaching, professional course designers, whether they're faculty or other types of professionals, where the courses are designed and then the faculty are expected to oversee and present the course as it's been designed. How does that interact with the concept of academic freedom, where the faculty member is being handed essentially the course in a certain structure in a certain way? And I've always been a little bit unclear, to be honest, about when colleges and universities create those kind of courses and then hire faculty to teach that particular course in that modality. How does that jive with the concept of academic freedom that a faculty member would have to decide how to present the material?
Well, my experience, Joe, is that in universities that have strong faculty governance and or collective bargaining, such as my own institution, that is not a very, very common occurrence. But I've done work for the state of Massachusetts, looking at Western Governors University, and they have the model. The entire school is based on a model of a master teacher designing a course, and all the faculty have to teach it in a very specific way. And all of the faculty, by the way, 95% of the faculty are what we would call contingent adjunct faculty, with master teachers who designed the courses. This is what you teach. These are the readings. These are the assessments, etc. And if you want to work in that environment, you have to accept that as a given. So I think it varies depending upon the institution, how strong the culture and the environment is in terms of faculty prerogatives in designing courses versus those institutions that do not have that. And I'm concerned because there are some major institutions such as University of Southern New Hampshire, Arizona State University to a certain degree, who move more towards, here's the course, this is what you teach and how you teach it.
I agree with everything Tony says. That can't be the best for education. It sounds like those contingent faculty members teaching the course designed by a master, or may as well just be graduate students doing review sessions. And it's certainly it just can't be the best thing for education. It sounds terrible. And I like the thought that, institutions that have good shared governance, that's rare. I think we should fight against that as much as we can.
Also concerned, if you want to look a little further down the road, is the adaptive learning courses, where the bulk of the instruction will be delivered by software. And the faculty, whether they're contingent faculty or otherwise, will essentially be tutors.
Yeah, it's a bleak future. My concern there is for the profession. I just, who's going to want to go into this profession if that's what it looks like? And that's a very serious concern.
Well, guys, we are coming to the end of our time. I wish we had another half an hour at least, because there are questions even from the audience that we just didn't get a chance to get to. But thank you, Joe. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Irene. Thanks to all of you that have participated in this. A quick announcement before you head off to the next session. The National Center is about to launch a new nationwide survey to update its database and to learn the role played by collective bargaining and shared governance in resolving COVID-19 related issues. The National Center encourages faculty representatives and administrators to timely respond to this survey. Again, another example of the great work that Bill and Michelle and the National Center do. So I encourage all of you to participate in that service. Again, thank you, Bill. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Joe, Irene, Tony, and everyone who participated, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Have a great day.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Terry. It was a pleasure. Joe and Irene, pleasure being on the panel with you.